The call came on a Wednesday morning, while Claire was standing in her kitchen waiting for the coffee to finish. She didn't recognize the number. She almost let it go to voicemail. She was running late. She had a 9 o'clock. The coffee wasn't ready yet, and she needed it to be ready before she could process anything. But something made her pick up. She'd think about that later. The small, unreasonable instinct that made her answer a number she didn't know on a Wednesday when she was already behind. The man on the other end introduced himself as a lawyer in Macon, Georgia. He said her name, confirmed she was who he thought she was. He said he was calling about the estate of Margaret Eloise Pruitt. Claire set her coffee mug down. She said, "I'm sorry. Margaret passed away?" He said yes, 3 weeks prior. He expressed condolences. He said her name was in the will and asked if she'd be available for a call or an in-person meeting to go over the details. He said it in the careful, even tone of someone who delivers this kind of news regularly and has learned to let the other person set the temperature of the response. Claire said she could do a call Friday. She hung up. She stood in the kitchen. The coffee maker beeped. She didn't move for a moment. Margaret Pruitt was her grandmother's sister. That was the clearest way to explain the relationship, though the word for it, great aunt, had always felt like a category rather than a person. She lived in Macon in a house Claire had visited twice, both times as a child, both times briefly. She was a small woman with good posture and a specific kind of quietness that Claire had always found slightly intimidating and had later, in adulthood, categorized as reserved. She sent birthday cards. She called on Christmas. Claire sent her Christmas cards in return, the kind you buy in a box of 20 and sign with a quick message and a promise to call soon that you mean when you write it. She poured her coffee. She thought, when was the last time I called her? She didn't have an answer. If this kind of story makes you stop and look at someone in your own life a little differently, subscribe to the channel. We look at real human situations here, the complicated ones, the ones that don't resolve cleanly. Claire Sutton was 41, lived in Raleigh, and worked as a project coordinator for a mid-sized architecture firm. She was competent and direct and had, over the years, developed what she thought of as a clear-eyed relationship with her own life. She knew what she wanted, knew how she'd gotten there, knew which parts had been luck and which had been effort and which had been both. She'd built something that was hers. She was proud of it in the way you're proud of things that cost you time. She was also, if anyone had asked her to describe herself honestly, not particularly sentimental. Not cold. People liked her. She had close friends. She remembered things about people. But the extended family web, the cousins 3 states away, the older relatives she'd grown up seeing at holidays and then less after she moved north, she'd allowed that to become background. Not maliciously, just through the accumulated choices of a busy life that kept moving in one direction. Margaret had been firmly in the background. Specifically, gently, completely in the background. She told her friend Jess about the call over lunch on Thursday. They worked in the same building, different firms, and met in the lobby cafe once a week with the regularity of a standing meeting. "A great aunt?" Jess said. "My grandmother's sister. She was 90, I think. 91. Did you know her well?" Claire considered this. "I thought I did," she said. "When I was little, we visited a few times. She was very particular about things. Nice particular, just she had opinions about how things should be done, and she just did them that way." She picked at her salad. "I haven't seen her in maybe 15 years. I sent cards." Jess had the look she got when she was deciding whether to ask the next question. "What did she leave you?" "I don't know yet. The call is tomorrow." Friday's call lasted 45 minutes. The lawyer's name was Howard Webb, and he was methodical and considerate and gave her time to ask questions at every stage, which she appreciated. He explained the structure of the will, the other beneficiaries, a church in Macon, a historical society, a neighbor named Ruth, and then he explained Claire's portion. The house, a savings account, and, as specified in a document attached to the will, a collection of furniture and household items that Margaret had listed by name and description, item by item, in a separate inventory. Claire's portion of the estate was not enormous by any abstract measure, but it was significant. It was more than she'd expected by an order of magnitude, more than she would have expected from a woman she'd sent Christmas cards to, a woman she'd mentally filed under family, peripheral. She sat very still on her end of the phone. "There's also a letter," Howard Webb said, "written by Ms. Pruitt, addressed to you specifically. It was sealed and attached to the will with instructions that it be delivered to you directly." "A letter," Claire said. "Yes, I can mail it, or if you're planning to come down to Macon to deal with the property, you could collect it in person." She said she'd come down. She didn't call her mother that evening. She told herself it was because she wanted to understand more before she explained anything. But the more honest version was that she already knew, from the second the lawyer said the words, "the house," that this was going to be a problem. Her mother called her. She picked up at 8:15, standing in her living room, and from the first sentence, she knew the conversation had already started without her. Her cousin Brian had apparently called her mother within hours of hearing from his own branch of the family, and the version of events that had reached her mother via Brian was that Claire, who had, as everyone knew, barely stayed in touch with Aunt Margaret, had been left the house and a substantial sum, while the people who had actually been close to Margaret, who had visited, who had helped during her final years, had received comparatively little. "I'm not saying it's your fault," her mother said. "I just think it's a strange decision." "I didn't ask for it," Claire said. "I know that. Nobody thinks you asked for it. It's just—" Her mother paused. "Margaret wasn't close to you. Not recently, was she?" "I don't know," Claire said, and she meant it. She was starting to mean it in a way she hadn't expected to. "Brian's upset. His mother is upset. I understand that. What are you going to do?" Claire looked at the window. The street below was ordinary Friday evening. People walking dogs, a car parallel parking badly. She watched the car give up and pull away. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm going down to Macon." She drove down the following Thursday, a solo 7-hour drive that she'd planned around stopping once, just outside of Columbia, for gas and food. She listened to a podcast for the first 2 hours and then turned it off and drove in silence and let the flat green of the Carolina landscape move past her and thought about what she actually knew about Margaret Pruitt. She could picture her clearly. Small, as she'd said to Jess, but not fragile. More like someone who had decided economy of scale was an aesthetic. Dark eyes, hair that had gone from black to gray to white, and had been kept very neatly, always, in a way that suggested the neatness was a point of principle. She'd kept a garden. She'd been a teacher, elementary school, retired long before Claire's first memories of her. She'd been widowed when Claire's grandmother was still alive, and the two sisters had spoken on the phone every Sunday. Claire knew that because her grandmother had mentioned it. She couldn't remember Margaret ever mentioning anything that personal. What she thought she'd known about Margaret: pleasant, reserved, capable, self-sufficient. The kind of older woman who didn't impose, who sent cards on time, who probably had a full life that Claire had never thought to ask about. What she was starting to understand, that not imposing was a choice, and that choices have costs, and she had benefited from that choice without knowing it. She pulled off outside of Columbia. She ate a sandwich in her car in the parking lot of a gas station and watched the traffic on the highway and thought about the letter she hadn't read yet. Howard Webb's office was on a quiet street in downtown Macon, in a building with an awning that had seen better days. He was older than his phone manner had suggested, mid-60s, reading glasses, a careful handshake. He gave her the inventory of the house and the letter in a manila envelope and explained the next steps for the property. He was generous with his time. She thanked him. She drove to the house. She'd expected it to feel strange. It did, and it didn't. The neighborhood was older, shaded, the kind of street where the trees had been there long enough to have opinions about the sidewalks. The house was a cream-colored bungalow with a covered porch and a garden bed in front that had been recently weeded. The neighbor Ruth, the lawyer had mentioned, had been maintaining it since Margaret's passing. She sat in the car for a moment. Then she got out, found the key on the ring Howard Webb had given her, and went inside. It smelled like old houses always smell, a specific layered smell of wood and must, and something floral that might have been soap and might have been memory. The rooms were tidy in the way that suggested the tidiness was habitual, not recently performed for company. Margaret's particular kind of orderliness. Everything in its place, nothing unnecessary, but not sterile. There were books, plants, a few of them, on the windowsills, tended. Photographs on the side table in the living room that Claire moved toward without quite deciding to. She recognized some of them immediately. There was one of her grandmother, young in a way Claire had only ever seen in very old photographs, a young woman she recognized primarily by her eyes. There were photographs of people she didn't know, people Margaret's own age, from her own generation, and there, among them, several photographs she did not expect. One of Claire herself, her college graduation. She had no memory of Margaret being at that graduation. She hadn't been at the graduation. Claire would have remembered. But there was the photograph, a candid, from a distance, the kind of photograph that is taken by someone who is present, but who is not making themselves known. One of Claire at a younger age, somewhere in her mid-20s, at what looked like some kind of outdoor gathering. A cookout, maybe, in the backyard of someone's house she couldn't immediately place. One of Claire more recently, within the last 5 or 6 years, she thought, from the way she looked. Standing on a street she didn't recognize, in a coat she did. She stood there for a long time. She didn't understand yet, but something in her was shifting the way the earth shifts before anything visible happens. She read the letter that evening. She'd found the bedroom that was clearly the guest room, unused but kept ready, the particular readiness of a person who leaves the door open for people who might come. And she sat on the edge of the made bed with the envelope in her hands for a while before she opened it. Margaret's handwriting was precise and slightly angular, the handwriting of a generation that had been taught to write and had kept the practice. The letter was 4 pages, written on cream-colored stationery, dated 6 months before Margaret's death. She started reading. Margaret wrote the way she'd apparently done everything, without ceremony, without performance, without hedging. She said she knew Claire would probably be surprised by the will. She said she'd thought about explaining it in person, on one of the phone calls they'd had over the years, but that it had never seemed like the right time, and that she decided, in the end, to let the letter do it. She said she hoped Claire could forgive her for the way it had to come. Then she wrote about the last 20 years of Claire's life, not in a vague or general way, in specifics. She wrote about the year Claire had nearly left graduate school. She named the year. She described the financial strain that Claire had struggled with that semester, the point at which she'd told her advisor she needed to take a leave of absence because she couldn't cover the next semester's fees. She wrote about how a supplemental award had come through at the last minute, a small private fund, not university administered, that Claire had been pointed toward by her advisor with the suggestion that she apply. She had applied and received it. She had assumed it was competitive, had assumed she'd simply been selected. Margaret had funded it. Through a small foundation she had contributed to for several years, specifically for situations like Claire's. She had not told Claire. She had told no one. She wrote about the period in Claire's late 20s when Claire had been looking for work after a layoff and had gotten the interview at the firm in Raleigh, the firm where she still worked, the foundation of the career she'd built. The contact who had passed Claire's resume along internally had been a former colleague of Margaret's son-in-law. Margaret had asked for the favor through 2 intermediaries and had mentioned it to neither of them again. She wrote about other things, smaller things. A recommendation letter that had gone out from a professional acquaintance of Margaret's without Claire ever knowing Margaret was connected to the person. A moment years ago when someone had spoken up for Claire in a room she wasn't in, and the someone had been connected to Margaret through a channel Claire had never traced. Not large interventions, not the things that determined who Claire was or what she was capable of. Margaret was clear about this. She wrote, "I want you to understand that I never thought you needed saving. I thought you needed a door left slightly more open. What you did once you walked through it was yours. But still." The page blurred slightly. Claire pressed the heel of her hand to her eye. She kept reading. Margaret wrote about why she'd never said anything. She wrote it plainly, without drama. She hadn't wanted the relationship transactional. She hadn't wanted Claire to feel indebted or grateful in the way that puts weight on things. She hadn't wanted the knowing to change anything between them. She had watched Claire's life from a careful distance and found it remarkable, and hadn't needed Claire to know that to make it true. She wrote, "I am aware that what I'm telling you now I could have told you in a phone call, over years of phone calls, and I chose not to. I'm not sure that was right, but it was what I could do." She closed the letter by saying she'd thought about who to leave the house to for a long time, that the house had mattered to her in a way she couldn't fully explain, and that the people it went to mattered accordingly. That she had not left it to Claire out of obligation or sentiment or proximity. She had left it to Claire because of a quality she'd observed over decades and believed to be real. That Claire, when given something, tended eventually to understand what it was for. The letter ended, "With love, Margaret." Not Aunt Margaret, not Great-Aunt Margaret, just Margaret. Claire sat on the edge of the made bed for a long time. She held the letter and looked at it, and then set it on the comforter beside her and looked at the window. The Macon night outside was quiet and warm. She could hear, faintly, someone's lawn somewhere, the distant sound of a television through a wall. She thought about a conversation she'd had a few years ago with a friend, a conversation about self-made, about what it meant to build something through your own choices and effort and staying power. She'd used the word a lot in those years, self-made, the particular pride of someone who had moved away and gotten there on their own terms. She sat in Margaret's guest room and thought about what self-made actually meant, and about how much of the frame she'd been painting inside had been built by someone she'd sent Christmas cards to. She did not feel like she'd been deceived. That was the thing she tried to locate and couldn't find cleanly. Margaret hadn't deceived her. She'd just acted, quietly, from a distance, because she'd thought it was useful, and then she'd carried the knowledge of it for 20 years without asking for anything back. What Claire felt was harder to name. Not shame exactly, not gratitude exactly, though gratitude was somewhere in it. Something more specific and more uncomfortable. The feeling of having been watched with love by someone she hadn't looked at carefully enough to know. The family meeting, if you could call it that, happened at her cousin Jennifer's house, 2 days after Claire arrived in Macon. Jennifer was Margaret's granddaughter, Brian's sister, and had taken the will hardest of the family members Claire was in contact with. She'd lost the house, which she'd apparently assumed, for reasons Claire now understood were not entirely unreasonable, would pass to her. Jennifer was not hostile. She was tight. The distinction mattered. She offered Claire coffee and made eye contact and introduced her husband with the warmth of someone who has decided to handle a hard thing with dignity, and Claire respected that. Brian was there. He was less measured, not aggressive, but carrying his grievance close to the surface, in the way some people do when they feel wronged and are determined not to let the feeling slide. There were 2 cousins she knew less well. They sat in Jennifer's living room and drank coffee, and for a while, no one said the thing they were all there to say. Brian said it first. He said it reasonably, she'd give him that, but clearly. He didn't understand why Margaret had made the choice she'd made, given that Claire had not been a consistent presence in Margaret's life, and that Jennifer had been, had visited, had helped during the harder years. Claire looked at her coffee cup. She thought about the defensive response that was ready. The, "I didn't ask for it." The, "I understand why you're upset." The legalistic, "I'm not responsible for her decisions." She had all of it available. She'd been running it in her head since her mother's phone call. She set her coffee down. She told them about the letter. Not all of it, the parts that were hers to share. She told them about the graduate school year, what Margaret had arranged, how she'd done it without anyone knowing. She told them about the job interview. She told them about the quality of attention it must have taken, for years, from a distance, through intermediaries, to follow a person's life that closely without being visible in it. The room was quiet when she stopped. Jennifer was looking at her with an expression that was hard to read, something that was recalibrating. "I didn't know any of that," Jennifer said. "I don't think anyone did," Claire said. "That was the point." Brian said, "Why didn't she say something to anyone?" "I don't know," Claire said. "The letter doesn't really explain it except she didn't want it to change things. She didn't want me to feel obligated." She paused, which is an interesting choice given how this turned out. Nobody laughed, but the air in the room changed slightly. "I don't want to fight about the will," Claire said. "I want to be clear about that. If there's a legal question, we can address it, but I didn't come here to defend something I didn't know I was going to receive." She looked at Jennifer. "What I can tell you is that she was not a person I understood, and I'm sorry for that. I could have understood her, if I'd tried." Jennifer looked at the window, a long moment. "She never talked about you the way she talked about family she was close to," Jennifer said slowly. "She just mentioned you sometimes, normal mentions. I didn't think—" She stopped. "She told me once that she was proud of you. I think I was 14, and I remember thinking, why is she proud of Claire? They barely see each other. And I forgot about it." Claire said nothing. "I'm not saying that changes everything," Jennifer said. She was honest in a way that Claire found she could respect. It's still hard to understand." "I know," Claire said. "I'm not asking you to find it fair. I'm just telling you what she was." Drop a comment below, not about what you would have done with the money, about the person in your life who might be watching you from a careful distance, thinking you don't need to know. She stayed in Macon for 5 days. She went through the house methodically with the inventory Margaret had left, which was itself a kind of document. Each item described with care: the walnut secretary desk, the blue ceramic lamp, the set of botanical prints in the hallway, the cast-iron pot that had been a wedding gift in 1962. The inventory made the house feel inhabited in a new way, like Margaret was still in the room, pointing at things. The neighbor Ruth came by on the second day. She was a small woman in her early 80s, the kind of person who carries a casserole dish as naturally as other people carry purses. She set the casserole on the kitchen counter and looked at Claire with the direct appraisal of someone who has earned the right to look at people directly. "You're the one from North Carolina," she said. "Yes," Claire said. "She talked about you." Claire looked at her. "She did?" "Not constantly, but when you'd done something. When you got that position at the firm. She'd been following your career in those architecture journals. She had several of them in the study." She said it matter-of-factly. "She told me you'd gotten a project you'd been working toward. She was pleased about it. She said—" Ruth paused, remembering. "She said, she doesn't take the easy route, that one. She said it like it was something she'd noticed over time and was confirming to herself." Claire stood in Margaret's kitchen and did not say anything for a moment. "How long did you know her?" she asked. 43 years, Ruth said. Claire nodded. She thought about calling Margaret. She counted backward, trying to locate the last time she'd actually called, not emailed, not sent a card, but called and talked for more than a few minutes. She found a gap that was longer than she wanted it to be. Was she lonely? Claire said. The question surprised her. She hadn't planned to ask it, but there it was. Ruth considered this. She wasn't a person who talked about loneliness, she said. She was occupied. She had things she was doing, things she was interested in. We had dinner twice a week, and she liked that. She paused. But I think there were people she'd have liked to be closer to than she knew how to ask for. She wasn't... Asking was not easy for her. No, Claire said. I don't think it was. They ate the casserole together at the kitchen table, two women who had nothing in common except the person who had occupied this house. And they talked for 2 hours. Ruth told her things about Margaret's life that Claire hadn't known and that she found herself storing carefully, the way you store things you don't want to misplace. A teaching career that had extended past retirement into volunteering for years. An attempt at painting in her 60s that she'd abandoned, but not without producing a few canvases she'd kept in the back bedroom. An argument with a developer in the 90s about a piece of land 2 streets over that she'd apparently won through patience and sheer written documentation. Claire went and looked at the paintings after Ruth left. They were stacked against the wall in the back bedroom. 5 canvases, various sizes, all landscapes. Not accomplished in the technical sense, but not uncertain either. Confident about color, tentative about structure. The work of someone learning something new with the willingness to fail at it in private. She stood in the back bedroom for a long time. The study was where she found the journals. Not a diary. Margaret hadn't seemed like a diary person. These were more like notebooks. Observations, lists, things she'd read that she'd copied out by hand. Occasional reflections that were more practical than personal. She'd been keeping them for years. Decades, some of them. Claire found her own name in several of them. Not frequently, but at intervals, dated, noting something. One from 8 years ago. C received the Raleigh position. She'll stay now. She has a tendency to stay when something is worth staying for. One from 5 years ago, in the wake of a difficult year in Claire's life that she'd thought no one in her extended family knew anything about. A year with a person who had not been good for her and had taken a long time to leave. The notation was brief. The situation in Raleigh seems to have resolved. She makes good decisions, finally, if not quickly. That will serve her. Finally, if not quickly. Claire sat in the study with the notebook and felt something move through her that she couldn't quite name. It was related to the thing she'd felt reading the letter, but different from it. The letter had been addressed to her, written for her, constructed with her in mind. These notebooks were not for her. Margaret had not imagined her reading them, and that made them more accurate in some way. The precise way a person writes when they don't expect to be read. She had been thought about, in this room, by this woman, across the years, with a specificity and consistency that Claire had not afforded her in return. She set the notebook carefully back where she'd found it. The decision about the house came to her in pieces over the last 2 days she was there. She didn't want to sell it. She understood that before she could have explained why. There was something about selling it that felt like doing the wrong thing with the wrong object, converting something that had meaning into something that didn't. But she also couldn't move to Macon. That wasn't the shape her life was. Ruth, on Claire's last evening, mentioned a thing almost in passing. The historical society that Margaret had supported, the one named in the will as a partial beneficiary, was in a difficult moment. Their lease on their current space, a building on a street 2 blocks from Margaret's house, was up for renewal, and the new terms were out of reach. Claire looked at her. Ruth said, "Margaret served on their board for 12 years. She was very particular about local history. She felt like if you let the buildings go, you'd lost something that couldn't be rebuilt." She paused. "She left them a sum in the will, but I don't know if it's enough for a new space." Claire said, "The house has a guest room I won't use." Ruth looked at her. "I don't know if it's big enough," Claire said, "for what they need, but I know someone who could look at the floor plan and figure out what was possible." She was thinking out loud, in the way you do when you're testing the shape of an idea. "It would need some renovation. I'd have to find someone local to manage it." "Ruth Elaine Beauchamp," Ruth said, "before you ask." Claire looked at her. "I wasn't going to ask." "You were thinking it," Ruth said. "I'm 82 years old and I know what people are about to ask. And yes, I would help. She was my friend for 43 years, and I'd like something to do with my time that isn't just keeping the garden." She drove home on a Sunday, the route back north through the flat, green South Carolina middle distance, and she thought about Margaret Pruitt in a way she hadn't thought about her when Margaret was alive. Not abstractly, specifically. The paintings in the back bedroom, the notebooks, the casseroles she hadn't made because no one was coming, the phone calls Claire hadn't made. The things Margaret had known about Claire's life that Claire had never reported because it hadn't occurred to her that Margaret would want to know. She'd called Margaret competent and self-sufficient and reserved. She understood now that two of those things were true, and one was a story she'd told herself to explain the space she'd allowed to grow between them. People who don't impose aren't always people who don't need. They're sometimes people who have decided, for their own quiet reasons, not to ask for what they need, and who live with that decision with such consistency that the people around them stop checking to see whether it still holds. She'd stopped checking a long time ago. Or maybe she'd never really started. She thought about the letters Margaret had written to her over the years, the birthday cards. She tried to remember what they'd said beyond the standard warmth. She'd opened them, she was sure of that, but she'd read them the way you read something when you're already sure of its general content, for confirmation rather than information. She'd been managing Margaret in a category and had missed the actual person. That was the loss. Not the 20 years of things Margaret had done for her without announcing it. That was a debt she didn't know how to account for, and she'd decided she'd probably never fully account for it, and that the only thing she could do was hold it and let it change how she paid attention going forward. No, the loss was simpler and less redeemable than that. It was the conversations they could have had, the things Margaret would have told her if she'd asked. The paintings in the back bedroom that Claire would have known about before she found them stacked against a wall. She merged onto the highway. She pressed the cruise control and let the miles go. She called her mother somewhere in North Carolina. Her mother picked up and asked how the drive was going, and Claire said fine, straightforward, and then said, "I want to tell you something about Margaret. Not the will, about who she was." There was a pause. Her mother said, "All right." Claire told her. Not all of it. The graduate school year, the job, the notebooks, the paintings, the 43 years of friendship with Ruth and the Historical Society, and Margaret's 12 years on the board. The way Ruth had described her, occupied, interested, careful about what she asked for. Her mother was quiet for a while when she finished. "I didn't know any of that," she said. "I know," Claire said. "Neither did I." "She was always—" Her mother paused. "She was always a little difficult to read, Margaret, even when we were all younger. She was your grandmother's sister, but they weren't— It was a different kind of relationship than you'd expect. Margaret was always just slightly off to the side, present, but not— You know." "I know," Claire said. "I'm sorry," her mother said, and she meant it. Claire could hear that she meant it. "I'm sorry I didn't push you to keep in better touch. I could have. I knew she was getting older and I just—" She stopped. "I assumed she had people." "She had Ruth," Claire said. "She had some people, but she had less than she should have." Her mother said nothing for a moment. "What are you going to do?" she said. Not about the money this time. About something else. Something larger. that didn't have a clean answer. Claire watched the exit signs move past. A town she'd never stopped in. A town she'd passed a dozen times without stopping. "I'm going to keep paying attention to people who don't ask me to," she said. She heard her mother exhale on the other end of the phone, a small, tired sound. "That's a good answer," her mother said. 3 months later, she drove back to Macon for a weekend. The renovations hadn't started yet. The plans were still in the negotiation and zoning phase, which was slower than expected, which was how those things always went. But she wanted to see the space. She wanted to see the house again, in a different season. She stayed in a hotel because the house wasn't ready for staying in yet. She had coffee with Ruth on Saturday morning, and they walked down the street to the building the Historical Society had been using. A small brick building from the 40s, well-maintained, a little crammed with the careful, collected documentation of a city's material past. She walked through it slowly. A volunteer in his 70s showed her around with the particular warmth of someone who had been doing a thing for the love of it and had nearly watched the thing run out of room. He told her about a photograph they had of the neighborhood in 1957. He pointed to a house in the background of the photograph, barely visible, just the edge of a porch. He said, "That's the Pruitt house." She looked at it. She said, "She would have liked this." He looked at her. "Did you know her?" Claire thought about the right answer. She thought about what the honest version of it was. "I was starting to," she said. She used some of the money for the renovation. Not all of it. The estate wasn't large enough for all of it to make sense, and she contributed what was proportionate without making it more than it was. It was a practical decision, straightforwardly made. She didn't tell people outside the immediate situation about it. She didn't want the gesture visible. She was aware, in a way she hadn't been 2 years before, of what it cost to do things quietly and how different the world looks to the people who do them. She kept the paintings. She'd had them carefully wrapped and transported to Raleigh. 3 of them she hung in her apartment, not because they were great paintings, though she'd come to see something in them she hadn't seen at first, but because they were the work of a person she hadn't paid enough attention to, and she wanted them where she could see them. She kept the notebooks, too. She wasn't sure she'd ever fully read them. Some of them felt private in a way that hadn't died with Margaret. But she'd read them enough. She knew what was in them. She knew what kind of attention they represented. She called her mother more often now. Not dramatically more, she wasn't performing a lesson, but she'd shifted something small in how she operated, in the same way that a small adjustment in direction changes where you end up over distance. She asked more questions. She assumed less about the answers. She'd learned something from a woman she'd been too busy to know, and the learning felt more like weight than relief. A weight she was choosing to carry, because carrying it was the correct thing to do with it. She thought about Margaret sometimes in the way you think about someone who has left you something you're still finding out you have. A specific kind of presence in the absence. Not grief exactly. You couldn't fully grieve someone you hadn't been close enough to know completely, but something adjacent to grief. Something that kept asking her questions she didn't have clean answers to. What does quiet love look like when you're not looking for it? Who is paying attention to your life from a careful distance, and have you checked? What would you find if you opened the letters? If this story left something in you that you're not sure what to do with, leave a comment. Sometimes all you need is a place to set a thought down for a minute. We'll be here.